Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Chris Martin. I am the Associate Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and I'm so pleased to be here with our colleagues from the Kyiv School of Economics. And I'm also grateful to them for co-sponsoring this series, as well as a co-sponsor, Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. Today's topic for our Kyiv Connection webinar is the lessons of Ukraine resilience. Today's conversation will be moderated by Alexandra Vacru, who is formerly of the Davis Center, our former executive director, and still our director of Scholars Without Borders programs, but she's also now the vice president for strategic engagement at the Kyiv School of Economics. And she will introduce today's panelists. Alexandra?
Thank you so much, Chris. So it's great to be here. It's wonderful to be doing the Kyiv Connection series again. And the goal of this series is to bring together voices that have similar approaches in the same field, but who rarely get to speak together in public. Today's conversation is going to be a little different than the ones we've had before, which have been firmly rooted in disciplinary debates. Instead, today, we're going to hear from two Ukrainian analysts who explore the question of Ukraine's resilience in two different angles. Our goal is to use the benefit of hindsight to understand why Ukraine was able to resist Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, and how this can help us better understand what's happening today. We're going to start with an exploration of the military context in which Russia, let's say, stumbled in 2022, and how the changing situation on the battlefield is informed by the lessons learned at the beginning of the full-scale war. This has important implications for European countries who've come around to understanding that they too must prepare themselves to defend against Russia, if not against a full-scale invasion, at least against drone incursions, cyber and arson attacks, and misinformation. We will then turn to the social and psychological sources of Ukrainian resilience. Because Russian aggression began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and trouble in the Donbass, Ukrainian society was better prepared to come to the full-scale invasion than it would have been otherwise. One of the sources of resilience is an understanding of Russia and how Russia might develop over the next decade. We're fortunate to have two excellent experts to guide us through these rather complex issues, and I will introduce them before turning the floor over to them. Yevgeny Malik was a Marine infantry sergeant in the armed forces of Ukraine. He has extensive frontline experience, having fought in Mariupol and across the Joint Forces Operations Zone, where he led combat missions, amphibious operations, and coordinated tactical planning under extreme conditions. From April 2022 to September 2024, Malik was held as a POW in Russia. He holds degrees in law, public administration, and reserve officer qualifications. He is recognized for his expertise in military leadership, crisis management, and strategic and tactical planning. He's a strong advocate for Ukraine's armed forces and veterans. Elena Davlikanova is a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in DC and the Sayhadachny Security Center in Kyiv. Dr. Davlikanova is an expert in strategic forecasting and the domestic politics of Ukraine and Russia. She also works on questions of defense and security, specializing in new forms of warfare. She co-authored the SIPA report containing Russia securing Europe, as well as Scenarios Ukraine 2032 and Scenarios Russia 2032. And we will put links to these excellent reports in the chat. Now, let me turn the virtual floor over to Yevgeny Malik, joining us today from London.
Thank you very much. This is a great opportunity for me, and nevertheless, this is my very first such way of cooperation in Zoom. Well, I will try to do my best, and please don't be so much critical, and I will try to give an answer for such important question, like why Ukraine still is fighting, and how is that Ukraine is still getting the front line, no matter that Russian Federation is still second army in the world, and we are doing much better than anyone else could predict, I think. So if you let me to start, I will first of all tell a little bit about myself. So I am right now almost 33 years old, and I joined to the military force of Ukraine in the year 2018. I joined to 36th Separate Marine Brigade, one of the best and most tough brigades, combat brigades of Ukraine armed forces. I did it just because I could imagine, I could know that this war will happen, and uh, I just wanted to prepare myself, and I was so right because when it started in the year 2022, I was in Donbass, Sector M, Mariupol direction. I was fighting for the Mariupol from the very beginning to the very end, and got to the captivity in the year 2022. Uh, I will give all the answers for your questions about the captivity in case anyone is interested about it. But right now, I would like to speak not about myself and my experience in the captivity, but to speak about the experience of Ukraine armed forces in this war. And to find an answer what is going on right now, we have to remind ourselves what was going on in the year 2022. As you know, on the February 24th, Russian troops attacked, as it well known, on from three different directions. But what is not truly like that, on my opinion, because Russian they tried to attack Ukraine at least 8 different directions, and the amount of troops was approximately 350,000 soldiers. And if we continue, we will find that no one could predict that Ukraine will stand even more than 2 weeks. But we did it. And I would like to explain as a soldier, as a surgeon, not as a general. I would like to explain people how did it happen on a tactical level, what is probably even more important. To show to give an answer, I would like to make a little bit comparison of, first of all, land forces of Ukraine, land forces of Russian Federation, and to make it more wide, to compare a land forces of, in my opinion, the most experienced and strongest army of European Union, that is land forces of French armed forces. And here you can see the table, which you can study, but I will tell you a little bit in details about it, about land forces of these three countries. What we have to understand, the land forces of Ukraine before the full-scale invasion was 200,000 soldiers and extra 100,000 territorial soldiers. At the same time, the army which was involved to the Ukraine, as we know by Russians, was 350,000 soldiers approximately, with the old mercenaries of Wagner and etc. At the same time, you can see that even nowadays, the land forces of France are slightly bigger than 100,000 soldiers. But I want to mention you that the territory of Ukraine and France is approximately equal. At the same time, if we continue to make a comparison, we can see that the amount of tanks of France is right now 400 tanks, and the amount of tanks in Ukrainian army was almost 2,000. I know that we had never have such quality as Leclerc, but I want to remind you that Russians attack Ukraine in more than 8 different directions. And on each direction, you need some amount of equipment. Other way, your troops will not be able to fight. Ukraine got this equipment. Just look at this table and compare these armies, the 3 different armies, and try to imagine yourself that Russians would involve not Ukraine, but France. What would happen in that case? If we go further, we will be able to compare anti-air systems which defends space in Ukraine and in France, and we will try to compare them with air forces of Russian Federation, which tries to attack Ukraine regularly during all these years. And if we will see this table, and this is open of sources information, you can check it in case you think that something is wrong, but believe me, you will be surprised. This is the reality, what you can see. The amount of long-range anti-air system from the very beginning of full-scale invasion, Ukraine got more than 200 of different types of systems, long range. At the same time, as we can see, France got even now just slightly more than 40, and against more than 1,500 aircrafts of Russian Federation, which immediately tries to involve and attack the state the way they did it in the year 2022 from the very beginning. So just look at this table and think about that in case in the year 2022, Ukraine would got not more than 200,000 soldiers, but slightly more than 100,000 soldiers. And we would get not the hundreds of anti-air systems which defended our space against 1,500 Russian aircrafts, but slightly less than 100. What would happen then? Please let's continue, and let's continue further, and you will see the result. Nowadays, you can see that Russians, yes, they do not use the aircrafts because of the amount of anti-aircraft systems. Ukraine could defeat air forces of Russian Federation, and they are not allowed to go to Kyiv or Chernihiv region, not speaking about even western part of Ukraine. But nowadays, Russians are using the dozens of rockets and hundreds of combat drones, such as Shaheds, and it seems that that's okay because Ukraine still stands. During the years, Russians do this since I got back from the captivity, slightly more than 1 year, and each night I can hear what is going on. So during the years, they tried to destroy Ukraine in such a way, but they are not able to do this. But again, let's speak what would happen. Let's speak what would happen in case Russian Federation would use all of these hundreds of drones and dozens of rockets, missiles, not against Kyiv, where we got 5 million people and where we got such a great amount of anti-aircraft systems, but against the regular European country and its capital. For example, London. What would happen in that case? You've seen the photo of Mariupol before. That was the city I was fighting in against Russians, and I got to the captivity. All my brigade got to the captivity, and the Azov regiment got to the captivity there as well. Why? Because we simply didn't have any anti-aircraft systems, any of that. So Russians aircraft, air jets, they just destroyed completely the city and all our positions. That is impossible for the infantry to fight in case you do not have support in as such as infantry vehicle vehicles, which provides you an armor in case you do not have anti-aircraft system, which provides you defense from the aircrafts, and etc. We didn't got this, and the result you can see in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in Chernihiv. We got this. And the result was that Russian army, Russian troops were completely defeated. Nevertheless, that were probably the best their troops. It didn't help them. Why? Because Ukraine got an equipment, and what is more important, got the people to operate this equipment. Because this is not enough just to hold in your bases some things, such some equipment, you need to implement it into your troops. You need to study your operators on the military drills. Ukraine, because we got the war in Donbass and this Crimea occupied it, we woke up and we started to develop our armed forces. And that helped us because in the year 2022, we were, I can't say ready, but it was much better in case we would have slightly more than 100,000 soldiers and approximately 400 tanks with them. Basically, what I would like to add that anyway, Ukraine nowadays, we don't need such amount of hard armored equipment, but we need drones. We need 1 million of drones. And here we can find the answer why Ukraine stands, why we can hold this front line. Because again, in the time when we needed tanks and infantry vehicles, we got them. Now we need something else. We need drones, and we got them as well. And this is the main, probably, on my opinion, this is the main lesson of this war, that you need to have an equipment which is reliable nowadays, and you need to have soldiers who can operate them. Exactly this will help your soldier, your army to survive on the tactical level in the front line, and that will help your country to survive in a war with such country as Russian Federation. On my opinion, this is the main lesson we have to learn. Also, what is even more important, on my opinion, that the Union of Ukraine, European countries, United States, because all of these countries help manufacturing drones in Ukraine and other countries, which help our troops to hold the front line. And that works. And everything what we can see on the political area, that Russia tries to destroy this union, to separate each country in the European Union, because they know that any European country, even the France, which is, on my opinion, really strong and experienced, even the France and others are weaker than Russian Federation. But together, we are stronger, much stronger. And even Ukraine, which got such low GDP, can stand against Russia when European countries and United States helping us. Basically, this is my main opinion and what I would like to explain to our viewers and visitors. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Evgeny. Let me now turn over to Elena. There she is. Elena, you're an analyst who studied Ukraine and Russia, and we've all heard a lot about Ukrainian resilience and determination, but the war is almost 4 years old. And aren't people completely exhausted? How can Ukraine possibly maintain the social and the political unity that it needs to keep fighting?
First of all, Alexandra, thank you very much for the invitation. It is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. As for the Ukrainian resilience, it is both a blessing and somewhat a curse to us because unfortunately it has become normalized that Ukrainians are so resilient that they might not need as much support as we actually need. But why we are so resilient for not only 4 years, because 4 years it's only about the full-scale invasion. We are actually fighting Russia since 2014, so which makes it 12 years. And the simple answer to this question is very simple. We don't really have a choice because occupation for Ukraine is not peace. It's not a solution. Occupation means more suffering, more genocide, more people who will lose their lives, their health, but this will not be as much covered as whatever Russia has been doing on unoccupied territories. So when this terrible tragedy is hushed, it doesn't mean that it doesn't take place. So as Ukrainians know very well what is going on, what Russia is planning for us as our fate, and the same picture is also very well understood by our neighbors, like the Poles, like all the nations of the Baltic states and Nordic states. We all know pretty well that if we stop fighting, the alternative is to either die or live an unlivable life. So why resilience is also a very important part of our life, because we are going through a very, very difficult time. And as one of my friends said, war is an abstract thing unless it happens to you. It is truly very, very hard to imagine what it is like to be at the front line, to be in the rear in a city, but every time when you go to bed at night, you know that you might not wake up. And it is very unfortunate that bomb shelters are not they are not enough, because if you have 4 million people in a city or even 2 million people in a city, it is very complicated to provide shelter for all of them. Moreover, as you also know, Russians are trying to create unbearable conditions of life. They are shelling our energy infrastructure. Today in Kyiv, the lights are available, electricity is available up to 5-6 hours every 24 hours. So it means that when you wake up in the morning, you might not get coffee because there is no electricity. But this is very good that you woke up. We have this very dark joke. In Ukraine, it's very simple nowadays. If you wake up in the morning, you go to work. If you don't wake up, you don't go to work. So overall, still, Ukrainians are not ready for concessions, and I'm sure that you are following the process of negotiations, and Russians are always, they were never serious about real negotiations. They were only serious about Ukraine's capitulation. But despite all the horrific conditions, and despite the fact that now war is part of the life of each of us, Ukrainians are not ready to give out territories because we know that Russians will not keep their word. If we agree to taking the troops out of, for example, Donetsk region, it means that tomorrow we will see Russians in Dnipropetrovsk region, more in Zaporizhia, they will be, in Sumy, in Kharkov, and so on and so forth. So whoever may tell you that if Ukrainians accept this demand to give out some territories in exchange for something, this is not serious. And I'm very happy, because currently I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm very happy to see that finally the White House also got what we all understood since 2022. Russians are not ready for peace, and they will not observe it when it comes to Ukraine. So overall, Ukrainians still are not ready for official recognition of the occupied territories and for transfer of unoccupied territories. So this is kind of despite everything that is going on to us. And if you are interested in maybe understanding a little bit more of how exactly it feels like, or maybe get more tips and very, very well-tailored advice on what to do for those nations who may fear war, and Boris Pistorius recently said that this might have been the last peaceful summer for Europe. Sagadachny Security Center tomorrow will release this publication, Coping Under Fire, Insights from Ukraine. And this will provide very, very specific things on how exactly you should prepare for war. And it is not about packing your documents or getting money and so on and so forth. It is about choosing your role, because people at war, they play very many different roles, but each role is extremely important, because some people like Evgeny, they are doing the hardest part. They are fighting at the front lines. Then there are are people who are staying in the rear and they are supporting economy. They are supporting the army. You all probably know that before the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian army was not well equipped, and then within a couple of days, it enlarged from almost like 300,000 to 1 million people due to volunteers. And this million people, they needed everything. They needed munition, they needed food, they needed sleeping bags, like everything, you name it, and these are volunteers that supported the armed forces of Ukraine at the very, very beginning. And of course, there are people who will not stay in the conflict zone. For example, there's a mother of small kids. It is very unfortunate that too many women had to give birth in Ukraine under shelling, unfortunately, because of a lot of stress. Currently, there are too many women who give birth prematurely, and Ukraine doesn't have enough boxes for these prematurely born children. So this damage that Russians are doing to our people every day, it has so many different aspects of it. We here provide also the tips for people in 3 different periods. So these 3 groups will have to go through very different experiences before the war, because you have to, the most important is to overcome mental firewall. It is very, very hard to imagine for most of us, and for Ukrainians, it was the same thing, to imagine that the war can happen to you. Because the war is always out there, somewhere, with someone else, especially, with maybe poorer countries. And unfortunately, Russia wants to restore its role as a global pole. And in order to do that, it has to not only conquer Europe, maybe not completely militarily, but also politically, economically, but also it has to re-establish its position with the United States. So overall, if we talk about the secret of Ukrainian resilience, we can see 4 pillars for it. And the first, the most important one, is civil society. I mean, apart from, of course, the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is civil society networks. And in Ukraine, there is this tradition of very, very strong and very quick formation of horizontal networks. It's a horizontal society. Moreover, because Ukraine has been oppressed for centuries, the overall attitude towards, or not the attitude, but rather trust to authorities is rather low, and people tend to look for each other. They tend to coordinate among each others when they need to see stress, to solve very big problems under stress. Then, of course, there was business and state enterprises. I believe that our the workers of energy infrastructure, the workers of railway, these people were true heroes. Self-government, community level, they made so much, like for the armed forces of Ukraine, but also for the internally displaced people. We had about 5 million people who left their homes, and they came all over Ukraine with literally nothing. No clothes, no food, no nothing. And of course, information resilience, because this war, it takes place not only on the battlefield, not only civilians are suffering, but it is a cognitive war. And unfortunately, Russia has been for too long very, very successful in shaping its opinion. And I should tell you that it was very successful in Washington for a very long time, for more than 3 decades. And it created so many dangerous narratives that currently have to be re-evaluated. And why they have to be re-evaluated? Because these narratives, they shape minds, and minds result in decisions. And it is very unfortunate that Ukraine was underestimated, that nobody believed it was an underdog. Nobody believed that Ukraine would withstand this aggression, that Ukraine would be willing to withstand this aggression. And currently we need to be seen, to be understood, and to be helped appropriately. Because this war, again, it's not the war of Ukraine. It's not a local conflict. It's not a conflict for territory. It's a global conflict. The results of the war in Ukraine will be be felt by the whole Western world. And if the United States doesn't want to become a regional power in a couple of decades ahead, we need to stop Russians right now, because Russians will stop where they will be stopped. So overall, Ukrainian experience, of course, cannot be simply transferred to other nations, because each nation is unique. But some of these tips, I'm sure, will be very helpful. And one of the most interesting cases is Ukraine's ability to very quickly tailor a lot of nicely done narratives about not only itself, but also about the consequences that will, again, will be felt by every one of us in case Ukraine, in case Russia prevails, let's say it this way. So maybe we can continue the dialogue, and if we want to talk about Russia, then
Well, actually, could I ask you to lay out the scenarios in your
yes,
report?
absolutely. So at the beginning of this year, we decided to work on mind shaping of our Western allies, and we decided to create Russia 2032 scenarios, a decade past full-scale invasion, perspective from the neighbor who knows too well. So we are looking into four major scenarios. One is strong totalitarian authoritarian Russia, another is weak totalitarian authoritarian Russia, then democratization of Russia, and finalization of the imperial collapse. Why we took these four major narratives? Because in my time of the in-resident Center for European Policy fellow here in Washington, D.C., I understood several things about major narratives, especially in DC, but also in some European capitals. First of all, it's fear that Russia will be destabilized, that this will lead to uncontrolled collapse of Russia, and this will lead to inevitable proliferation of nuclear weapons. Another very strong narrative was democratization of Russia, and there were so many Democrats who don't have their homes, they cannot live in Russia anymore, but somehow not having influence back home, they were trying to persuade everyone that democracy is just right there, Russia needs a little bit of help, and it's going to be solved. And of course, the most important and most realistic scenarios is either strong or weak totalitarian, authoritarian Russia, and depending on our decisions today, we will have to deal with either one or the other. And it is in our interest to create all the conditions for us to deal with the weaker Russia. Because otherwise we will get back not only to the times of the Cold War, we will end up in a direct confrontation of NATO and Russia, because it will have enough strength to challenge NATO. And also at the end of our publication, we look into the consequences of usual Western policies when it comes to Russia. So it is a reset, and we've seen another attempt of reset a couple of months ago, strategic caution, and even now I hear some hopes. In my opinion, this is wishful thinking, that it is possible to establish predictable and stable relations with Moscow, and of course confrontation, but it doesn't have to be a military confrontation, it doesn't have to be to get into the war, it doesn't have to lead to it, but we need to not stay in the defense all the time, but we need to try and shape Russia in order to avoid a bigger confrontation. So if you ask us how Ukrainians wish to see Russia, this is it. So in our opinion, Russia, in order to for us to have peaceful Europe, to have a wider democratic world, to just live the life that we were promised in the 90s and the beginning of the 200s when we had the vacation from history. So we need Russia to be decolonized, deimperialized, reformed, and peaceful. And when it comes to reformed and peaceful Russia, Ukraine has a lot of experience on reforms of the post-Soviet state. We are happy to share. And moreover, in this case, it is also in the interest of the United States because it is very unfortunate that in Washington for too long there was this idea of reverse Kissinger. Finally, as far as I hear it right now, this idea is finally abandoned because it is impossible. But in the case of decolonization of Russia, there could be parts of Russia that will be democratized, that will be Western oriented, and this will help the West to ensure its interest, including in the high north. So if we look at what is going on currently with Russia, unfortunately, with all the sanctions and with all the pressure of the most of the richest countries of the world, Russia manages to prevent economic collapse. Russia manages to collaborate with China, North Korea, Iran, because for 4 years to run full-scale military-industrial complex with the spending that you can see on the screen in the presentation, which is way higher, almost twice higher than what every NATO countries is investing, because for NATO it's not in reality 5% of GDP, it's 3.5 plus 1.5. So Russia is, it doubles that. Moreover, it is way cheaper to produce weapons in Russia in comparison to Europe and especially to the US. So we need to be very careful because they are arming themselves. And not only they are arming, they are not using everything in Ukraine. They are storing drones, they are storing missiles. And because the warfare has changed, because it is moving to low cost, high precision, and low mass equipment, we need to also be ready to deal with that. And Evgeny showed you how our skies look like almost every night. So overall, when it comes to my message for the United States, we tried resets with Russia, like every American administration since 1990s tried to reset relations with Russia. And every time more red carpets are being laid to not that many Russian presidents that we have seen since Russia became independent from the Soviet Union, basically from itself. We don't see any really positive changes. And we need to be careful with how exactly we view Russia and what exactly we are going to offer those to offer Russia in case of ceasefire, and how many sanctions are we going to lift. And the last message is that we do not need to hope that tomorrow, if Putin dies, the problem will solve itself. Because back in 1999, when a person who is seen as a great Democrat, President Yeltsin, he already back then made it very clear that Russia wants both Europe and Asia. So we need to understand that this problem is very strategic and it is long-fetching, and we need to be very realistic in what exactly has to be done for the democratic world to save itself, basically.
Thank you, Elena, for that very comprehensive presentation. We have a few questions on a wide variety of subjects. So let me start by tackling the military question for Yevgeny. There's a question about North Korean involvement in the conflict, specifically about North Korean cluster bombs, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about the extent to which North Korea is actively involved. I've read, for example, that they've basically given all of the shells that they had to Russia, and now they're not able to do that anymore. But maybe you could tell us what you know about that.
Well, as I can see the question about the cluster bombs and drones of North Korea, first of all, North Korea doesn't have drones. As I know from my friends who were fighting with them in Kursk, these North Korean soldiers, when they saw drones first in their life, they were shocked, and well, for them that was something unbelievable, like a Terminator movie. I don't know, but the thing is that they are very motivated because of propaganda. As you know, North Korea is closed country, and what we have to know, they got really good ballistic rockets. There is one type of ballistic rocket which they produced for Russian Federation armed forces, and Russia used them against Ukraine, and they are bombing Ukraine with the North Korean ballistic missiles, which are not produced in Russian Federation. Russian Federation got their own Iskander M ballistic missiles, but North Korea helped them. Shaheds drones, they used to be from Iran, but nowadays Russia produce with China, with the help of China, they produce these Shaheds mostly on their own territory, and they made the same Shahed and named this Shahed like Gerань. Basically, this is the same. This is a simple copy, and they use it against Ukraine. What would be next?
So next, there's a question about the corruption scandal. There are actually two questions about that related to the energy sector. So Tom Remington says, can the efforts to curb high-level corruption in Ukraine today be conducted without weakening Ukraine's governance and defense capability? So let me just say a few words about the corruption scandal, and then maybe I'll ask Elena to talk about the public attitudes towards Ukrainian governance and towards elections, for example. So the corruption scandal is extremely disturbing because it suggests that during wartime, when everybody is sending 1,000 hryvnias to buy drones for the front line, that some people have been siphoning off money from the money that was supposed to go to harden infrastructure. There are supposedly investigations taking place. We have no reason to think that that's not the case. There are questions about how high in the government this goes, whether Zelensky knew or he didn't know. And it's certainly true that the government is going to have to take some serious steps now in order to prove that they're serious about addressing corruption. That appears to be happening, although we'll have to see what happens in terms of prosecutions and actual trials. But I am not quite as optimistic as the people who say, oh, this is great news, you see corruption here is uncovered. It's not great news, and I don't think we know everything about it yet. I would say, however, that what we do know is that corruption is pretty widespread in Ukraine, in Russia, in the United States for that matter, but there aren't as many countries that are tackling it the way Ukraine is tackling it, in part because, as Tom mentions, it's absolutely essential to keep the Europeans on side and to keep them committed to helping Ukraine fight this war. Maybe, Elena, you could talk a little bit about how you see the political mood right now in Ukraine.
Well, we have all seen how important the fight with corruption is for Ukrainian people. When there was an attempt to dismantle NABU and SAP, people actually went out on the streets. And the good thing is that the president heard the people, and this dialogue in the times of war is preserved. So in my opinion, the fight against corruption is one of those values, along with respect to human rights, along with respect to democratic institutions. This is why Ukrainians are fighting against Russians, because Russian world offers nothing of the kind. Ukrainians are not, they do not tolerate corruption, especially during the war, and especially on such a scale. And I'm sure that there will be, when elections finally take place, Ukrainians will say their word. However, currently at this particular stage, in order for the country to survive, we need to wait until there will be a possibility to hold elections. Because if we decide on holding elections now, first and foremost, we will rob the right of people who are fighting at the front line to vote on the one hand, but also to run, because we will have to have local elections and parliamentary elections, and Ukraine is a parliamentary presidential republic, and we need to ensure that the new elite, our military, will be able to contest for power. This is number one. And number two, no one today can ensure that Ukrainian civilians will be saved on the day of elections, because you see that even with that many anti-drone and anti-missile solutions all over the country, every attack brings more death, every attack brings more destruction, and knowing how Russians are acting, they will on purpose target election commissions and places of mass gathering of the people. So in order for us to have those elections that meet all the standards, and Ukrainian elections have been very democratic since the revolution of dignity, and we have very high standard of election process. So we need to be able to organize them accordingly.
Could I ask you, Yevgeny, has the military, the soldiers, for example, that you're talking to, have they had a reaction to the corruption scandal? How does it affect morale?
I can tell you about my own opinion and feelings about corruption in the military sphere and etc. Because I like math, I like numbers and everything what relies on it. And I know I will make a comparison for you again because we have to compare everything. And I, as a military, as a simple mariner, I know that Ukraine produced some drones, and the price of this drone is $1,500 in average. But the company which produced it has to pay someone. For example, yes, we know, let it be 60%. And this is corruption, and this is horrible. Yes, I don't like it. But at the same time, we can use a German company in Germany which produced the same drones. They produce the drones. They don't need to pay anyone in the government, and they don't need to pay anything, any 60%. No corruption. But the price for the drone is $10,000. Well, I know that there are like rich people, poor people, thieves, good people, bad people, but I am fighting on the front line. I am not interested in that. I am interested in what I have in my hands. What is the technique and how can I use it? And how can it be massive? Because in case I have one super mega tank for $50 million in the front line, which is like in the First World War, 1,200 kilometers, I don't need this thing. I need 1,000 things. Let it be not $50 million per one, but $500,000. And I don't really care who earned on it and how much money. I care about the amount of this equipment, because without this equipment, we love to say about the will, but will do not destroy the thing. Will not kill your enemy on the battlefield. We were fighting in Mariupol. We didn't have a lot except the will. We were fighting like crazy and we were motivated. But I've been 2.5 years in prison after that. So I don't know what was the reality there. I know the reality on the front line, and I know that we got the needed amount of drones, and that helps. I know that we
Well,
got
let me ask you
plenty
a drone
other problems,
question.
but yes, of course.
There's another drone question that follows on from that. So let me read it to you. Early in the full-scale war, Ukrainian drones were clearly superior to Russian drones, and that seems to have allowed Ukraine to innovate and hold off Russia. But now Russia has been innovating as well. Could you describe the state of the drone competition currently? Is it basically a numbers game at this point? That is, whoever can produce or procure more has the upper hand? And if so, what are the solutions to increase Ukrainian drone production?
Okay, I can describe. We are losing nowadays. Exactly right now, we're losing, unfortunately, because again, it's not just about. I made the table for you. I tried to explain. It doesn't work like, oh, you made some machine and it just substitute everything else on the battlefield. No, it will not be. In case you have super aircraft system and you got super air troops, it will not protect you. And the thing is that you need to. I've seen the comment of someone who wrote that you need multiple operations, multiple troops, and to involve it, you need a great amount of operators. You need to study them. You need to take this special weapon techniques, technologies, and implement it into the troops. And how can you implement it if you don't have people? That is simply impossible. We got the problem with the people because this is hard to fight with the Russian Federation one by one, on the front line, more than 1,000 kilometers. This is hard. People are dying, and all of us who we want to live, we try to hold, but it's hard. And the problem with the people creates the problem with the technologies. If you don't have people who are ready to fight, you may leave your technology somewhere at your home, because how can you use it on the front line?
And if I may just
Please, yeah.
add a little bit on that, yes, it is very true that there is the arms race. And what Russians are doing, they study our innovations and they scale them up. So there is a clear theft of technologies. The change of technological solutions, I mean, technological solutions become old every 3 to 6 months. So whichever innovation you have over there, it's really difficult to enjoy your successes. However, what is good is that Ukraine is very good in developing this manned-unmanned cooperation of people and machines, and not only air drones but also ground drones. And currently there are solutions that allow operators, because they are hunted by Russians, to stay very far from the kill zone. There are some solutions that will allow to control drone hundreds of kilometers away from it exactly. And there are solutions like hybrid platforms that are bringing in mothership drones further, closer to the front line, and then from there this mothership drone releases the drones that then perform the tasks. Also, you probably see how our special forces use these technologies when it comes to hitting Russian refineries and Russian ports very far in the rear. And operations like Spiderweb will, of course, it's unique, but at some point in maybe a couple of years, this could be, by the way, a challenge for a lot of democracies, because it could be used as a way of new state terrorism of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and so on. So we need to be very aware that we need to work on anti-drone solutions. We need to to protect the skies, and that is why Ukraine is asking to our partners to participate in the Sky Shield initiative, which is long overdue.
So we have time for one more quick question, and I know Yevgeny has to drop off. So let me ask you both the same question. In your opinion, what is the most urgent gap or need for the international community to address at this point in the war?
I will answer, and I have to leave. And basically, I can see the good question about the. Oh, I lost it.
Okay, just answer my question.
Yeah, I got it. You asked about the gap, and one person is asking about the balance between offensive and defensive weapons. And I would combine these two questions and give one answer. This is a really good question. I like it because, again, balance between offensive defensive weapon. This is math. This is something we have to count, and I can tell you that, well, there is a well-known phrase that the sword defeated the shield on the battlefield. And it happened not on this war, that happened even much before. This process was studied, as they know, in Israel-Arabic wars, 1960s and etc. So even then, the sword already beat the shield. And the offensive, if you want to win, you need more offensive weapon. You will never find an armored vehicle, even in case the price is $500 million for the infantry fighting vehicle or tank. Still, it will be destroyed. 1 hour, 2, let it be 5 hours on the battlefield, but it will be burned. Nowadays, there is no such weapon which couldn't be destroyed. Couple days ago, Ukraine destroyed anti-air systems S-400 on a distance 400 kilometers from the front line. Actually, this anti-aircraft system were created to defend a space on the distance of 250 kilometers behind the front line, and they were destroyed more than 150 kilometers from their position they had to be. So what is the sense of this weapon? Explain me, please. And if we will study, not just dreaming, if we will count the price of the weapon, the price of the missiles, we will find out that, well, a lot of countries are doing not really good job.
So if I may jump in quickly, so first of all, our Western partners need to bring the sense of urgency back, because it seems like Ukrainians are so resilient that they have been holding for 4 years and it's fine, like they'll be fine. I think that we are at the stage when we need to kind of to have the reality check. We need to not go again around and again ask for weapons and again get rejections, and then this is a vicious circle. It is very clear for now that Europeans and Americans they have to increase production of the weapons that are actually working. Ukraine provided all the list of things that we need to withstand to not only play in defense but also offense. And let us also use our imagination for a scenario, what's going to happen if Ukraine falls. And if it happens, it means that in 2 years, a 4 or 5 million army of well-trained people with experience in the new type of warfare will knock at the Europe's door. And this means that the United States will have to sacrifice the lives of their own men and women in order to preserve more or less tolerable new world order. So let us currently get our act together and help Ukraine not only remain on the political map, but remain as a democratic, strong nation that is not only the shield of Europe, but is a part of the new European security architecture.
Thank you, Elena. That is the perfect place, I think, to leave things. It's been a great conversation. I wouldn't say uplifting, but extremely important. And I hope that we can do it again sometime. Thank you all for attending, and thank you very much to our 2 speakers. It was a really good conversation. Bye-bye, everybody.